achieve that look using not only a masking in develop mode, but also like layers in edit mode. These are really strong tools. They're non-destructive in ways that maybe more traditional dodge and burn adjustments weren't. So we'll be able to sort of highlight how to do those, how to tweak them, how to change them, and then how to also sort of just get best results. We have an image here where we're going to take implied lighting. So we're going to take lighting that already exists in our image, and we're going to further embolden that. We're going to take those hints from the image itself and just look at highlighting or rather bringing up the exposure in the areas of the image that are already that are already highlighted, that are already in view, and then look at sort of darkening the areas around the edges of the image, the areas that aren't necessarily the focal point of your image. Okay, so we got all of the folks in our workshop today. Looks like we can get started here. Just a side note, so we're going to be doing a workshop. I believe it's on the 10th. If you haven't already signed up for it, it's going to be a workshop that the developers host. The developers are going to be going over the adjustments, the changes, the new features, etc. In ACDC 2025. So I would recommend signing up for that workshop. It happens once a year. The developers provide a extremely in-depth content in regards to these tools and the changes of the software. So both myself and Rodrigo are going to be working to bring together some not only workshops for you on new content coming up in in September and October, but also we'll have tutorial content ready on the YouTube page as well for that. One of the things I might note is if you can, the developer workshop is really cool. If you haven't participated in one, we have done, I think, one for the last 2 to 3 years with really, really good feedback in regards to it. So what they do is they sort of go over all these tools, but they also talk about the intention behind them, and so what they were wanting to achieve with these adjustments and why they made these considerations. The other thing too is because the developers are the ones that are receiving a lot of the feedback for the software, and so what people are requesting tools wise in the software, they're the ones that are implementing those adjustments as well, and they can talk to you a little bit more about their decision making process and like why they do those adjustments. So I'd highly recommend participating in that workshop. It's very cool. It's very in depth in a way that me and Rodrigo are more designed for tutorials and workshop content that is going to be accessible, and we're going to take away a lot of the complexity in favor of really showing like best use cases. The developers will show you a little bit more depth than that. That's a great question, Scott. Yes. Yeah. All of our workshops are recorded. It'll likely be on YouTube. The only thing I would say is that because by the time that when they're going to be when they're going to be doing that workshop, it's possible that there's still some changes that are going to be made to the user interface, meaning that the way you see the software visually, the way it's presented, it might change. So there might be some changes from the time that they do that workshop to the time that it's released later in September. So, but yeah, I'd say probably it's going to be recorded unless they have some conflicts with that. So, does that answer your question, Scott? Hopefully it does. Obviously, the release is something that they still make updates and changes to up until the point of release, so there's some moving targets, but the product is largely finished. So, okay, let's get started. Let's get this thing out of the way here. Can everybody see, just so I'm not crazy, can everybody see that mouse highlight? So it's just a little purple blue circle that appears around my mouse. Just want to make sure people can see that. Makes it easier for because the mouse is so small. So thank you, Mike. Thanks, Scott. Awesome. Okay, so let's look at develop mode first, and then we'll talk about edit mode. And like I said, today, the emphasis of today is going to be on spotlighting. So what I mean by that is selective lighting, or lighting parts of our image in a way that sort of enhances the image, and less on general lighting adjustments. Okay, so let's open up this image here. I really like this image. I've used it once before for a workshop similar to this. It really has incredible sort of base lighting, but it's very flat in appearance. And so one of the benefits of spotlighting is it helps define depth of field. And it brings a little bit more dimension to your image, especially when you have images like this that are quite flat in appearance. So what I mean by that is because this image actually has a visual component that leads us inwards into the center, the focal point of this, looking at this bridge here, what we want to do is we want to use lighting adjustments to embolden that. So in AC/DC, specifically in develop mode, you might notice that all of our filter tools are on the left here. Filter tools meaning effects, basically, the effects to our image. And they're broadly sort of categorized into, first and foremost, four really, really, really broad categories. So we have tune, detail, geometry, and repair. We won't talk too much about this, but basically tune refers to your lighting and color adjustments. So think brightness and hue. Detail refers to pixel detail. So how that comes across is largely noise. What else is it? Skin tune, noise reduction, chromatic aberration. So if your image has noise that you want to remove or noise you want to add, that would be sort of the space for that. Geometry is sort of as described. Geometry is the area of develop mode where you would adjust the dimensions of your image. So you actually change the final visual sort of size, appearance, rotation of your image, that sort of thing. This is really good and handy. Probably something you want to start with prior to making any development adjustments in your image. That being said, develop mode is both non-destructive and parametric, meaning that all of these adjustments are being applied at the same time. So even if you do geometry at the very end as like sort of a finishing touch, that's something that you can do in develop mode as well, which is very different from edit mode, where this would be the first thing you change. And then repair just refers to the same thing that clone tools, patch tools, that sort of thing. So you can take elements of your image and you can use that as a reference point for fixing other areas of your image, often used to remove blemishes in images. But what we're talking about today is largely in tune, brightness, and hue. Those are the adjustments we're going to be making. From within that, there's two broad sections. There's essentially general applications like we're describing. So general applications will affect your whole image non-discriminately, right? So if I opened up the general tab, for example, things like exposure, highlights, contrast, vibrance, clarity, etc. And then there's further adjustments like white balance and light EQ, color EQ, that sort of thing. So these are obviously going to be affecting your whole image without sort of selection processes involved. For example, if I was wanting to change the hue on my image and I want to take the hue of green and make it more yellow, well, I could pull that slider into the green portion of my, the yellow end of my green portion here. And what that does is it obviously adjusts the whole image. As you can see there, that's sort of like a before and after. Vice versa, if I wanted to make it more lush, more turquoise, I could do that. So these are sort of general application adjustments. But spotlighting doesn't use general application. It uses sort of a masking. So for those uninitiated or for maybe new to AC/DC, masking refers to basically choosing portions of your image that you're going to apply an adjustment to. And so how this works is it basically takes uses a mask, which we'll sort of go into further detail on when it comes to edit mode. But it creates a space where we've decided to apply an adjustment. And then we're going to see when we increase the effects, that adjustment be applied to that area specifically. And then the other parts of the image won't receive that adjustment. Masking comes in different types. So when we're masking something, what we're going to do is we're going to make functionally like a selection first of some form of criteria. So with this mask type, when we open up develop mode, we're sort of introduced 6 different masks, right? So we can make a mask of a subject, which this image doesn't really have. I mean, it might have a subject in this case of the bridge, but subject just means area of that's in focus, right? Typically, a subject might have will be in the foreground, where your background will be in the background, obviously, but the foreground might be something that's in greater. It's in focus, where your background might represent something that's a bit blurrier. There can be multiple subjects in an image. You might have an image where you have, like, let's say, food photography. You might have like a photo of like a cola, and next to it, like a plate of hamburger and fries, sort of thing. And they'll both be in focus, and they'll both be representative of an AI subject, or sorry, a subject in your image. And by clicking on this, what it would do is it would take that selection, and then we would therefore mask it and apply adjustments to that. I'm just curious if this even is going to do anything. So let's try it out. So this would be an AI. Yeah, like I said. So it's kind of the focal point of this image. It represents the bridge. That is, however, not what we want to do. So I'm going to delete that. Vice versa. Background is going to be, in this case, the literal opposite of that. So whatever the AI subject would be, the background would be the negative space of that. So in this case, the background would probably select everything but the bridge. Yeah, okay. So there you go. AI sky selects the sky. Not much more to say about that. Then you have the three that we're going to be talking about today. So brush, linear, and radial gradients. So the brush tool allows you to choose what to mask and allows you to brush on and off the areas of your focus. The linear gradient refers to a gradient pattern from top to bottom, or bottom to top, or from side to side. However, where we start the application of an effect. For example, let's say exposure, right? We'll use exposure as an example here. So the area that is indicated in red is going to be receiving the effect, right? That effect is feathered. So what that means is the area that's at the top, that's in this case, quote unquote, quotations marks here, the most red, will receive a more a full application of the effect. So think the effect will be applied in 100%, right? There we go. The area of our image here that is starting to be feathered in its application will receive a lessened, increasingly lessened effect of the application. So around this line here is where we'll see the application of 100 end, and then it starts to go 99, 98, etc., all the way to the end where we sort of approach the middle here with an application of 0. So somewhere right in this area will be an application of 50%. So that's where we'll see 50% of that exposure be applied, 0% of that exposure be applied approximately around here. And this is sort of, like I said, where that application or the feathering begins. So that sort of looks like this. And then radial gradient is an effect, in this case, the same exact thing. Let's see if I can show my mask here. There we go. So where the application begins at the edges, right, working its way inwards towards the center to this sort of oval or circular pattern. Same thing, greater degree of feathering will lighten the effect, right? There is a lighter effect there where there's more degree of incrementality between the edge and the end of the effect versus no feathering, which in this case is a hard stop. So now, these are all very powerful tools. They're powerful when used in combination. So if I was going to be making masking adjustments to this image, I might combine some of these methods. In this case, in this particular image, we're going to be combining both radial gradients and brush gradients. So let's talk a little bit more about this image. So here's our default image that we're going to start with here. One of the things that's pretty evident in this image, right, is that the area that is most in focus and is also brightest is the area that is represented in the center here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this image and we're going to further embolden or reinstate, rather, those sort of pre-existing lighting conditions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this radial gradient that we saw earlier here, And I want to make an exposure adjustment that's going to take the edges of my image and almost like create like a vignette. And to do this, all I'll do is I will reduce the exposure of my image. And this exposure adjustment, as you can see, is being applied not to the center of my gradient, but rather the outside of my gradient. So if I was to click on show mask here, I might increase the feathering because I want that effect to be more gradual from the edge to the inwards here. What I probably don't want is something like this, right? Where it's too, it looks like I'm creating some sort of, like it looks like a photo in a locket kind of thing. You know, I don't want that look. So what I have here is just a really gradual adjustment. And the other thing too is keep in mind as well that this adjustment is also visible when I turn on and off the mask here. So if I am hovering away from my image here, you can see that the original looked like this and my adjustment is going to look like this. So you can see that that is made darker. This effect is this one right here. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add more masks, right? But the starting mask that I've created is represented in this mask order here, and it's first on the list and it's on the left there. So if I wanted to make further adjustments to it, for example, I want to further decrease the exposure here, I could do that by clicking on this mask here. What I would also do, right, okay, is I would go in and I'd say, okay, well, that's done a fairly good job of darkening or reducing the exposure on the edges of my image. But let's also create a brush stroke here. So what I could do is I could take my masks, add a brush stroke, and by doing that, now I have two masks. So I have the first mask that is this radial gradient that I have here, and then I have the second mask that represents my custom adjustments with the brush. What I'm going to do, I'll just make sure to leave show mask on so I can see these adjustments, but I would probably increase the exposure here. I might increase the clarity and maybe increase the contrast slightly. And I'd start to paint on, in this case, using the brush to paint on the areas where I'm already seeing light being applied. So let's show this mask really quickly. So these are sort of the areas that I'm seeing that are the areas that are being touched by in this case, very vertical light that we're seeing here. And so when I use that tool, the brush tool, you can see that these are now the areas that are sort of in focus here, predicated on what this mask is illustrating here. And when we go on to showcase this in edit mode, we can show more of how this process works in regards to masking. But for this purpose, it's pretty much just touch and click. So I can just go through and make this adjustment. And this red area is indicative of where I'm going to see this effect applied. So I'm just going to go through, I'm going to clean this up, make some adjustments here. And what we can do is if we want to change something a little bit further, like for example, I wanted to maybe just warm that portion of my image as well. And maybe I want the exposure to be slightly less, somewhere around there. I can do that in this mode by clicking on the brush itself. Or vice versa, if I decide that I don't want the edges to be so dark, I can pull the exposure up by clicking on my mask of the gradient. So I can move back and forth between these two adjustments. And so what I'm left with is an image now that has two masks applied. So I have a radial gradient applied to the edges of my image to darken them. And then I have a gradient rather, a brush mask applied to the highlights in the image that I wanted to sort of bring out and further highlight. So by doing so, so our sort of our original image here and our applied adjustments here, what you'll see is when we've used these pre-existing lighting conditions, I've drawn attention inwards, right? I've created a sense of dimension in this image, and I'm just using elements in my image that are already the colors they are or the brightness levels that they are to sort of apply these changes to my image. It's pretty standard. This is like a very, very useful way of taking the lighting conditions that are already present when you took the photo to sort of use those to sort of draw more attention inwards to affect your image in such a way that is not unnatural. This wouldn't be like the opposite of these changes where I'm starting to brighten the edges of my image and darken the center, although certain image might call for that. What I can do here is with my masks active. So I have an active mask here, right? That's indicative of my little dot, blue dot here that tells me these adjustments are active. From there, if I wanted to make some general adjustments, I could. For example, maybe like I said, I wanted to, I wanted to make my image overall a little bit more warmer in tone. So this application of white balance, being that it's not located on the masking tab, is now applied sort of universally to my image. So it's very, very subtle, but it's mostly felt right here. So that would be cooler and that would be warmer with it. And then maybe I could do something like, let's see here, like a tone application. I could do, I could take the highlights here and I could say, okay, I want my highlights to be, let's say I want the highlights to be a little bit more green, maybe a little bit lighter in tone. And so now I have the white balance adjustment as well as a tone wheel adjustment that's affecting just the highlights, in addition to this mask that I've created. So very powerful tools. This is sort of the develop mode version of this, where I've taken my original image and then I've gone in and I've added this mask here that applies to not only the background in my image here, I've taken that and I've sort of made it darker. And then I've made the highlights in the areas that were already that had some lighting adjustments. I've sort of further emboldened those, created a sort of natural appearance here that is way less flat than the original image. So that's going to be right there. And then what we can do is we can start to look at making some adjustments here in edit mode to apply and sort of look at similar ways we can achieve these results in that mode. Does anyone have any questions as I go on here? Happy to answer some, just sort of plunking away, and we'll sort of look at edit mode and its relationship with spot adjustments right now. The masking, if you've never used layers in edit mode, will be a little bit complicated, so we'll cover that and sort of talk about how those effects are applied. Just from, I don't know, I'm assuming most people are, I noticed a lot of names that are, and people have participated in previous workshops, so I'm assuming a degree of familiarity with layers and masking. But just out of curiosity, is there anyone that for the masking in edit mode, layers is brand new? Like, is that something that you've never done before? Just curious about that. Feel free to just sound off in chat. So for those of you that obviously that have been in previous workshops, this might be something that you're very familiar with. Okay. No one's signing off, which means that there's some degree of familiarity there, which is great. Awesome. Okay. So when it comes to edit mode doesn't work quite the same way. Bob said, it's not brand new to me, but my results in edit mode clearly shows I'm terrible. Okay. We'll talk about some strategies to get better selections. Edit mode doesn't work the same way as develop mode. Edit mode is far more robust. However, there are some complexities, and most notably, edit mode is destructive, or parts of it are destructive. Whereas develop mode is fully non-destructive. Nothing you do in develop mode can significantly alter your quote-unquote original image. Whereas edit mode, there are some things you can do to your image that are going to be destructive. However, edit mode, when used properly, is also non-destructive. So there's elements of this that I think are to be understood, and that add to the layers of complexity of this mode. Develop mode is truly a photo editor, where edit mode is essentially a how would I describe this? It's a photographic art tool, So whenever we're interacting with layers, and what I mean by layers is I mean that we can have multiple images in the same file. So here I have not only my image of my dock side here, but I also have underneath of it my original image. Layers allows us to combine elements of multiple images, and this is fundamental to photographic art or even graphic design to a large extent, taking multiple photos and combining them to create something new. You know, I could take my, you know, dock here, which has kind of the same dimensions as the bridge from my bottom image here, and I can combine them together to make something wholly new, you know, and very interesting visually. So what I mean by that is these layers allow us to essentially combine components, whether it be images, but also selections. And then we can use these adjustment layers as well to apply certain effects. What you might have gathered, which is important to understand, is that layer order in edit mode matters a lot. So what I mean by that is layers are applied top down. So your image or effect that is on the top of your layer order, predominantly this one right here, this will be applied and essentially visually presented to you before layers that exist beneath it. And this is totally visible to you right now. What I mean by that is dock image here is obviously visible where the parts of my image that are underneath of it are in the layer that appears beneath it, right? So if I was to pull this layer up, that would be visually presented to me, and the layer beneath it won't be. Now there's three changes to this rule. So layer order always matters, right? The topmost layer is always the one that's presented to us. However, there's three ways to get around this. So one is masking, as we sort of showcased in develop mode. But that being said, we only really used one photo in develop mode. So now we're going to be exploring the ability to use multiple layers, and masking is going to be the one way that we can sort of affect how layer order is applied. Second way, this is probably pretty obvious to you all, but opacity is one way to affect the layer order. So when I reduce the opacity of my layer that's on top here, what happens is there's an adjustment to this this particular layer. So what ACDC is telling me here is that when I change the opacity to 50, right, on layer 1 or the 001, the dock layer here, it's telling me that 50% of the pixels in this image, this layer, are being presented to me, and 50% of those pixels are being hidden from me, right? So in essence, half of this image is fully presented. So pixels in this image obviously are super duper tiny, and so when combined together for an image, what this looks like, right, is it looks like it has a slight transparency to it. So by adjusting the opacity, I'm seeing a transparency because the amount of pixels are being essentially being turned off in this image. So 50% of those pixels are being turned off, which means that I'm seeing through to the image that appears beneath it. If I was to reduce this to say 25, so now 75% of the pixels in this image have been, essentially are turned off, right? They're not visible to me. So way to adjust layer order and visual presentation, number one would be masking, which you're going to get to. Number two would be opacity, right? So reducing opacity. Number three, very similar to opacity, would be to apply a blend mode, which essentially blends the two images together algorithmically, depending on some sort of criteria. You can look these criteria up. I think Rodrigo had done a workshop on it pretty recently, but when we change this blend mode from normal, which would just be default, right, to a different blend mode, you can see how these adjustments are applied. They change, right? So one of the things you might note is that up top here, we have two probably familiar blend modes. One being dodge. Dodge brightens an image or increases the exposure in it, and also contrast at the same time. Whereas burn does the opposite, reduces the exposure while also increasing the contrast. So these two are ways to apply spot adjustments on our image. And we'll go into detail on that. But all of these blend modes can be applied to any one particular layer. So hopefully what we understand now is that, okay, so layer order matters. So the second thing is that in order to get around or to create sort of adjustments, we may want to change how that layer order is applied. And so the way that we can do that is by masking our image, reducing the opacity of a particular effect or layer. And then the third way is to apply a blend mode. So practically, let's look at something different. So that's with two images, right? Okay. But what about just making an exposure adjustment? So here's our exposure adjustment. I added that by clicking on the exposure adjustment layer, just underneath the layer order here. Quick side note, when working in ACDC in edit mode, just note that all the layer functions and the exposure adjustments, these are all non-destructive, okay? Whereas the filters that appear on the left, they're destructive. So I would, if you're going to make a change using one of these tools, just be sure that that's exactly the change you want to make. I'm not going to go into too much depth on this. I've touched base on this in further in other workshops, but it would just be a bit of an aside today to go over the differences between filter adjustments and edit adjustments. Just broadly know that these are destructive, these are non-destructive. In fact, actually, I'm going to hide the filter menu. There we go. So here's my exposure adjustment, right? So, okay, so exposure adjustment, right? Located on top of my layer order. My layer, my image in this case, located beneath it. Three ways to adjust the sort of, or see or adjust the layer order in this image. Number one, reducing the opacity. So I'm reducing the opacity on my exposure adjustment. If I reduce it to 0, it's like nothing ever happened. If I have it at 50, it's functionally like the exposure adjustment was applied halfway, right? And then full is full. Number two is I can change the blend mode of this exposure adjustment. So maybe I want it to only be an overlay layer. And what that means is the exposure adjustment is largely being having an effect on the highlights of my image. Excuse me. Versus something like hard light, even further, versus something like multiply, no effect, you know? So these are ways to get around that. The third way to get around that is to do what we did in develop mode. What we did in develop mode was we created a condition predicated on a selection. So, you know, we showcased how it would work with a linear gradient, where we said, hey, I want this effect to be applied from the top down, radial to be affected inwards from the outsides, and the brush strokes, but just being able to click and choose where we want our effect to be applied. Works the exact same in edit mode. The main thing is that all of these masks are not created for you by clicking on the linear or radial gradient button. We have to choose how we want to have that mask affected. So there's just one more element here. So let's showcase what that looks like. So if I wanted to create something like a brush adjustment over my image, what I might do is, okay, let's say I want to do the exposure adjustment here. I want to do exposure, and I want to do similar to what I did with the develop mode. I want to darken the edges of my image here, okay? So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I have my exposure adjustment here. I probably want the opposite effect, right? I want it to be actually darker, right? The other thing too is, oh, okay, well, if I have it like this right now, it's a general application. It's being applied to the whole image universally. I don't want that. So now enters masking and sort of how to understand masking. So our mask is this little box here. It's this thumbnail. And by application, when the mask is white, okay, so this whole box here is white. That tells me that this effect, the exposure effect, is turned on. Means it's being applied. if I was to take this mask and just set it as black, that tells me that this effect is not applied or it is turned off. So masks are very binary. They work basically, they're either off or they're on in your image. There's slight complexity to that changes that rule, but for the most part, the way that we understand them is black equals off, white equals on in our image here. So this is a general application, meaning the whole image is turned off right now, but we can change that. We can brush on, we can spot adjust particular parts of my image. What I want to do in order to do that is I want to make sure that my mask is the thing that's selected, okay? I don't want to be selecting on another layer or a different adjustment. I want to make sure that this is the exposure adjustment that I'm working with. And I want to make sure that this is the mask that I'm working on. And then how we would adjust that is we would take our brush tool, right, that I have here. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that the brush tool is sort of set to white, which means that the brush is going to be applied or the effect will be turned on. This is kind of counterintuitive to what people experience when they're brushing on a layer. So I have my layer, not my mask, selected here. When I brush on a layer, yeah, it brushes white on my layer, right? And you can see that it's represented in the thumbnail here. That effect is destructive. Don't want that. However, when I'm interacting with a thumbnail on the mask here, when I brush on white, it's not going to affect my image in that way. What it's going to do is it's going to apply the exposure adjustment. So what you can see when I brush on, right? What I've done is I've created that situation that I had in my first image in develop mode where I've created a functional radial gradient. So I've brushed on. So earlier when I said there's 3 ways to affect layer order, number 1 was opacity, so just changing the opacity of a layer. Number 2 is blend mode. And number 3, importantly, is masking. And we can see it right here. We can see that our mask is being applied exactly how I want it to. So the white area, okay, of my mask is quote unquote turned on, or it's being applied. And what is the effect? Well, the effect is a reduced exposure. So let's verify that with our image here. All the edges of my image are essentially reduced in exposure. So we can see that that is turned on for that area there, and that effect is being applied. Vice versa, you know, the center of my image here is black, which means that in the thumbnail itself, that means that it's going to be turned off or there's going to be no effect applied. Okay. And that is verifiable by my image. You can see that the center of my image is essentially the default settings, right? You can see that the edge is turned off. Or sorry, the edge is being the effect is being applied in the center. There's no adjustment. So what I've done is I've essentially recreated a radial gradient in my image. And then from here, what I can do is I can tweak these values. Well, first and foremost, it's a mask. So I can click on this mask at any point and I can just go through and lighten those values if I want or darken them. This is completely non-destructive. I can do whatever I want with this part of my file here. The second thing I can do is if I wanted to, I could take this mask and I could invert it. There's an inversion of the mask represented in the thumbnail here, right? So now the edges of my image, that effect is turned off and the center is turned on. Maybe if there's any confusion here, the confusion might be occurring in that the effect of the exposure is to darken it, but you can see that the thumbnail, the edge is white. Don't think of that as color or brightness, just think of it as area of application. So vice versa, we can take the exact same method or functionality and we can go, okay, let's do this to the parts of that image that we want to brighten up. So I'll just add another exposure adjustment, right? And in this case, what I might do is I might increase the contrast and increase the exposure. And but I don't want this application to be applied to my whole image. So what I'll do is I'll take this mask and I'll just make it black right now. I'll invert it and that'll turn it off. You can also make a mask black by right clicking on it and setting it as black. And so that'll turn the whole mask off. And then from there, what I can do is I can go in and I can brush on the areas that I want to have to be the highlight. Same as last time, I'll just do the exact same areas. And I might reduce the effect of that by lowering the opacity. I'm actually going to lower the opacity on my other one here too. There we go. So if I was to look at this now, my second adjustment, well, this is a exposure increase, right? And it's also a contrast increase predicated on a brush strokes. So in this case, I've brushed on the center of my image here, the areas that I saw that were in focus. And now if I was to look at my original image here and my new image, it's less flat. There's more dimension to it. We've kind of pulled the area of interest into the center and just emboldened already pre-existing adjustments. Now, earlier we talked about, dodging and burning, which is functionally kind of what we're doing, right? We're just we're adjusting exposure. If I wanted to, I could set this exposure adjustment to something like dodge, right? I could dodge this layer by applying a dodge blend mode. So dodge is going to have a really aggressive effect, but I can maybe adjust that further by lowering the opacity. And for here on my exposure adjustment, I've set this to dodge, which means that the area of my image that I've brushed on the highlights is now dodging. Versus the exposure edges, the sort of area that maybe is intended to be burnt. Now I could apply that burn and then lower the opacity accordingly. So ultimately what I'm doing is sort of when I'm using masking in this way and I'm increasing or decreasing the exposure of an area, with something like the mask thumbnail tools and the brush tool, is I'm essentially dodging or burning a part of my image. But I can also literally apply a dodge or burn blend mode to those things, and it sort of further emboldens that effect. It isn't necessary. I can just have it on like a normal application, but just something to keep in mind that if that's the effect that you want to really have a high contrast in those areas, that might be what you want to do for that blend mode. Does anyone have any questions with anything I've covered so far? Basically what we've covered in develop mode was how to mask selectively. And then we've taken that in edit mode and we've sort of gone into a bit further depth because edit mode requires you to sort of make those decisions with the mask in real time rather than just a point and click on a masking function and having that effect applied. We've gone into a bit further depth. Is there anything in regards to masking that's not being understood? Bob, I know you said, you're worried about your skills in edit mode. Maybe something to keep in mind is that when you're brushing on a mask, something that you can do, right, is you can change the size, obviously, of the nib that you're working with. The feathering can be adjusted. The opacity can be adjusted so the degree that your change is fully transparent or fully opaque. And then what we can do, right, is we can also take any pre-existing mask I have. One note is that when I click on exposure, that's where I get the ability to increase or decrease the exposure on my adjustment. When I click on the mask itself, mask properties pop up. So this is where it enables me to invert my mask. This is where it enables me to increase the feathering on my mask. What that does is it would basically increase the degree of gradientiality between the edge of the effect and where the sort of the brush strokes end. So similar to with the radio gradient, it would just make that ease transition a little bit. It would just ease that transition. So if I had a feathering of 55, it's going to be less intense than say if without a feathering. Same goes for this. I could click on the mask and increase the feathering here, and you can see as I do that, it's so subtle. So subtle, but yeah, it does have that effect as well in this. So we have Opacity, we have blend modes, we have exposure adjustments with the masks applied. And in this case, all I did was showcase two methods of applying an exposure. So the first one we did was we applied exposure adjustment that sort of featured almost like a vignette, darkening the edges of my image. And then the second one, we did a spot adjustments to the areas that we saw that were already highlighted in this case. One of the things you can also do, okay, is let's create an exposure adjustment again. We'll turn these two off. And let's just expose this down. One of the things you can do is you can take your mask, okay, next to your image here. And what I should be able to do is use a radial gradient to affect the mask itself. So if I do this and apply a radial gradient using the gradient tool, not the brush tool, I can commit this gradient to my image. And you can see there that this is a more smooth application, a more circular application of that, the one that I drew at the beginning, which was just drawn by hand, right? What I can also do is I can click on this, and right now it's kind of set to the edges are the thing that are being exposed and the center is being underexposed. Well, I can just use the invert mask tool to get the effect that I want, which is when I underexpose the edges and I have the center remain the same. So that adjustment can be made using something like the radial gradient tool, not just the brush tool. So the other thing is I've just largely used exposure here, but if I wanted to do something like increase the, maybe like the clarity of my image, clarity can be applied in the same way. So I can dramatically increase the clarity. Maybe I can soft light. Yeah, there we go. You can see that there's more noise in that portion of my image now. What I can do is I can take this clarity, same thing I've done with every other tool. I can turn it off and then use the brush strokes to turn it on in the center of my image here. You can see it really affect the gravel in that area. And that way, when combined with something like the exposure adjustment and the effects that I've applied here, you can see that that area, that's actually way too much. So we're going to turn it down, but there we go. That's way better. But you can see that that area is also now, in addition to it being in focus and exposed, it's also, in this case, the sharpness is increased and it's easier. There's more granular detail there. So, starting image, final touches here. Then maybe the last thing I would do personally to this image is I might adjust the vibrance in it. Might increase the saturation slightly. The other thing too is I want this image maybe to be a bit more green instead of orange. It's very orange right now. There's two ways I could do that. I would bring it into light balance and I might pull the temperature down and the tint into green, and that could easily get that effect. Alternatively, I could take the RGB values and I could just increase the green and the blue values in the image as well. I can also take the color EQ if I wanted to and click on that. And all I could do is maybe change the hue in the greens to a bit more blue. So that might be the effect that I'm going for. It's much more lush. It's not as yellow. That's sort of like a finishing touch that I would apply to the whole image non-discriminately. No masking there. But overall, what I have here is, so I have my base image. Above that, I have a exposure adjustment that's underexposing the periphery of my image. I have a lighting exposure adjustment, so increasing not only the contrast, but also the exposure selectively to the leaves in the center of the bridge here. This image, this is just for testing. I've increased the clarity in the center of my image. So there's sort of the center that's in focus, but also I've just increased the sharpness there. I'll turn this vibrance off, turn this white balance off. And then I just basically pulled my greens that were more on the yellow end into the blue end. So that's an adjustment there. And then what we can do is I'll just save this as an ACDC file. By saving it as an ACDC file, this enables me to essentially revisit or adjust this image in the future. We'll go spotlighting test. And what we can do now is we'll just compare this to our original image. So those are my adjustments. I'll take this spotlighting one, and I'll just take these two in manage mode here, and we'll just compare the two visually. So there's your before and after with all the effects applied. You can see that, in this case, darkening the edges, lightening the center of my image, increasing the clarity, and just adjusting the greens in my image. That covers it for today, folks. Is there anything you want me to go over? Do you have any questions? Thank you for participating. Thank you, Mike. Like I said, if there's no other questions, that covers it for today, folks. I'll upload this on to YouTube. I also have some more workshops to schedule for next month. Thank you so much, Not. Thank you, Hartmut. Thank you, Bob. And like I said, do participate in the workshop on the 10th. It should be really good. It'll cover a lot of new tools. And then, like I said, myself and Rodrigo will have more and more content coming up in the next couple months for that as well. Okay. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Laurent. Awesome. John, thank you. I'm so glad. Happy to do them. I really enjoy doing workshops. It's one of my favorite things to do with this, with ACDC, is teach people how to use the software to the ability that I can, Thank you, Dale. Yeah, and then as for the release, will it be lost? Losted, George? What do you mean?